almost at the end here to dinner. It's been an amazing day, and I really appreciate you all sticking around for a little bit about personalized medicine, personalized health. But before I jump into that, and by the way, we're going to give a couple of short talks here, and then we have an amazing panel, George Church and Esther Dyson. And we will also be including you all and hopefully getting some questions from you. And in fact, to start out, some of you have taken this survey, but some of you have not. I'm going to include you just for a moment here, if that's okay, to get you. You've been sitting here very patiently all day, so I'd love to have you participate in a question. And I, as a journalist, get to sort of poke you a little bit, because that's what we do. And so, in a way, this is what it's all about that we're talking about here. It's about staying healthy for as long as we can, our loved ones, basically anyone that we know or anyone that would like the option of living a long, healthy life. So, how long do you want to live? Okay? I've asked about 40,000 people this question in various talks like this. So I'm going to tell you at the very end of my brief remarks here how the others voted, but I don't want to influence you, so I'm not going to say anything right now other than to give you 4 possible answers. So 80 years, that's about the life expectancy right now in the United States from birth. We're living a little longer because we survived birth. 120 years, which is about as long as any human being has lived as far as we know. In fact, the oldest lived woman, it was a woman, lived to be almost 123 years old. Again, this is as far as we know. 150 years, very interesting. This would assume some sort of fix, genetic or otherwise. But I'm not going to tell you that we actually have a fix like that. But you can decide, is that going to happen? Am I going to be 25 forever or not? Or am I going to grow old and frail? You all can decide. And then the final and 4th possible answer is forever. And by the way, the folks at Singularity talked me into adding forever on there. That wasn't originally on the survey. So, are you ready? Okay. How about 80? How many people? Okay, can't quite see you all out there, but not surprising for a Singularity University that there's not a vast number of people of you who lived 80. How about 120? Okay, you're okay with life extension, but maybe hedging your bets a little bit. How about 150? Surprisingly few, so we are going to have forever. I think 120 won overwhelmingly there. Interesting. Okay, so at the end of my brief remarks here, I'm going to come back and show you how about 40,000 people voted for this. So we're going to talk today about personalized medicine during this session, but I actually prefer to call it personalized health. This is my family, and by the way, of course, the personalized part is about your family, you, and on a meeting largely about technology, we do have to keep circling back to that we're talking about real people that we care about, and trying to keep them healthy. So personalized health is keeping you healthy in a personalized way. Personalized medicine is a sort of subset of that. So we're going to be talking about both in the panel, but my particular focus as a journalist has been around the health part. And we talked about, in this meeting, you heard Daniel, for instance, yesterday, Eric Topol last night. I normally show a bunch of slides about all the cool things that are going on, but since you guys have seen enough of that here already, I just thought I would slap up something about integration, because we're talking about exponential technologies here, but we also have to have exponential integration. Because one of the curious things about all of these technologies happening at the same time is they're not all happening at the same time. And so this is as crucial as having the individual technologies work. And what you see here is basically the integration around biology. These are all the different facets of the human body that we're studying, that we're trying to figure out. And this isn't even adding the technology yet, but integration is crucial. So as a reporter, thank you guys, by the way, for putting up my picture sort of in the buff from Wired. I don't know what possessed me to do that a few years ago, but about 12 years ago, I started writing about genetics and some of these technologies as a reporter, but I was frustrated because how do you tell this story? How do you make it interesting, especially in the early days of genetics? So I decided to go out and test drive these technologies. So for the last 12 years plus, I have been taking virtually every test you could possibly take. I slowed down a little bit in recent years. For instance, Larry Smarr's microbiome tests, he's way beyond anything I did. way beyond anything anybody's ever done. But I continue to do some of this testing. But just to give you some of the metrics around the test and some of the results I've gotten, I've had my full genome scan, and I have over 30,000 genotypes annotated or genetic traits identified. I've got over 1,000 environmental toxins tested. Remember, we're talking about integration here. It's not just genetics. In fact, it's not even just molecular. But environmental toxin levels, these are things like pesticides, mercury, we all have trace elements in us. So what does that mean? What can you find out about that? I've been scanned every which way. I've actually spent literally dozens of hours in MRI scanners, which is some of the most boring hours you will spend because you're lying there. I kept falling asleep, ruining their data. But anyway, lots of different things from the scanning technology standpoint, proteomics, microbiome, as I said. And back when I did most of this testing, we've been talking about the exponential changes around cost. It's already come down, all these tests, by about 100 grand. It costs about 50 grand to do this today. Still not exactly in the realm of everyone getting these tests, but there you go. So what did I find out? So the future me here. I'm going to give you just a really quick, a few little answers here, a few little test results out of the literally tens of thousands of data points that I have. So DNA. And by the way, these tests, most of them are either confusing or not useful yet. And I do want to say as a journalist and hearing all the wonderful possibilities here, we still have a long way to go on a lot of this making a lot of this data and this technology work. So warfarin sensitivity. Warfarin is a blood thinner. You physicians and medical people know that. I'm a hypermetabolizer, according to my genetics, which means if you give me this drug at a normal dose, it will do very bad things to me. And this is a validated genetic marker. It's actually been black boxed by the FDA. That's a useful marker for me to know. Not so useful are actually a lot of markers. A lot of genetics until recently was single markers in a population that didn't have a lot to do with focusing on an individual organism. Like heart attack, I actually have over 400 individual results, low, medium, and high risk. It really shouldn't be that way. It should be one or the other. Empathy, that's one of my favorites. There are a lot of neurobehavioral genetics. And these are not great studies. It's very hard. I'm getting better all the time. But I do have a high risk for low empathy. But I don't really care what you think. So not sure as most of these tests. I mean, the environmental tests, for instance, I have 50% higher levels of DDT than the average person in the United States. That's probably because I grew up in eastern Kansas when they were still spraying this stuff. And then an MRI scan that tells me that I have normal greed, whatever that means. All right. So I'm going to do a little deep dive here just to show you the progression, not only in this testing and how one can find out information about themselves and possibly what it means, but also how far I've been taking this. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So mercury. We all have trace elements of mercury, or trace amounts of mercury inside of us. It's a deadly toxin at high levels. The tiny little minute levels that we have inside of us, it's unclear really how harmful they are. But it starts with coal. Most of the mercury that we get inside of our systems starts with coal. It's burned in power plants, and China is still churning out a new power plant about once a week. We too are burning a lot of this stuff. It gets into the environment. This is actually pollution coming across the Pacific right over here. Guess where it's falling? So mercury is in those pollutant clouds. It's falling right off our coast here. It gets into the food system through fish. We eat it, and that's how we, in fact, get our mercury. So as a little experiment, as part of Experimental Man, I decided to violate one of my prime directives, which was to do no harm to me. Remember, I'm a healthy guy. So what I did was I intentionally exposed myself to mercury by going out and catching a fish myself off the coast of California. I live in San Francisco. This was not the fish. I couldn't find a picture of a small enough one. But anyway, it was big enough to have mercury in it. That's a halibut. And I also bought a swordfish steak in the Ferry Building fish market up in San Francisco. And I had this halibut for lunch and the swordfish for dinner. And I did a before and after mercury test. So tested in the morning, had the 2 meals, went back the next day. And here's the results. 4 parts per billion mercury levels, and this is blood mercury levels. So that's what I had before. I had not eaten any fish. By the way, mercury fluctuates pretty rapidly in your system. When it comes on board, you bounce up, and then and your body clears it most of it anyway, in about 20 or 30 days. So after that meal, guess what it was? 13 parts per billion. And the EPA threshold, the safety threshold for this is 5.2. So I was just below it, went way up. And then if I tested again 2 or 3 weeks later, it probably would have been coming down again, unless I went out and had sushi. So I took this a few steps further, though, because remember we're talking about integration here in personalized health. And there's a new field, or at least new in quotes. It's actually been around for a while, but it's being talked about a lot more. And I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about it, called ecogenetics. And this is the combination of genes and the environment, and I'm sure that George will be talking a bit about this because he has an organization, among many that he has, that deal with this. So some colleagues of mine and I have come up with this notion of what's called the triad of life. And we even have a nifty little logo there. It's genes, environment, and traits. So this is really what health is all about, and I think you're going to be hearing a lot about genetics, obviously, over the next several decades, but you're also going to be hearing a lot more about how it interacts with the environment. And by the way, most research in the past has been 1 or 2 of these elements of this triad. You have drug companies developing drugs around traits or phenotypes or disease or whatever you want to call it, throwing things at this disease, trying to see if they can find something that works for cancer or whatever it is. Sometimes they'll tie in molecular biology like genes, mechanisms, so you have those 2 pieces of the triad, genes and traits. Very few times do you see, though, drugs being developed with the environment stuck in. On the other hand, you have toxicologists that are connecting some environmental factor like mercury with a disease. And there's literally decades of data out there, talking about big data, that the CDC, the NIH, everybody has been conducting studies. Every time there's some dangerous chemical gets out, a spill or something, they start running these big longitudinal studies. So genes, traits, and the environment, ecogenetics. And I, of course, after thinking a lot about this and trying to integrate, plugged this into my own data to figure out how sensitive I am genetically to mercury. So, these are 4 genes that have to do with genetic sensitivity to mercury. Now, until I started working on the book, I didn't even realize that there were genes that had something to do with sensitivity to mercury. But you all know about the Mad Hatter, right? And if you read Alice in Wonderland, but that actually really happened. There were these people that worked making felt hats in the 19th century in various places in Europe, and they used mercury to turn fur into felt. And some of them kind of literally went nuts. They went mad. Their teeth fell out, their hair fell out, they went crazy, but not all of them. So clearly there was something genetic going on even back then. And in fact, it's well known even before genetics entered the scene that certain people are more sensitive than others. So the way you get, as I mentioned, mercury is fish. And the other way, by the way, does anybody have those silver fillings still in your mouth? Yes, okay, I won't make you raise your hand, although somebody did. I still have a couple in my mouth, but those are half mercury, and that's another source of mercury. So I kind of went crazy here as a journalist. For the very first time, I decided to literally put my money where my mouth is, and I started a company around this. So we actually have a new company that's coming out that's going to be able to, and that, by the way, is missing pieces, like say the name of the company, which is called Ecogenetics, and the name of the test, which is called MercuryWise. I'm not sure why it's not on there, but anyway, this will be an online test. You can order it next spring, and it's been kind of fun because this is based on very intense clinical data and learning from some past efforts to try to bring you genetics that was more statistically based than clinical. We set out to try to give you a very solid test for this. So, as I said, remember the triad. This is an NIH-funded study that this company licensed the data, the IP around, and it was a test for mercury that took 500 children and gave half of them amalgam fillings when they needed fillings and half of them not. Now, I don't really condone that, but I wasn't involved with the study. But it did intentionally expose these kids to mercury. Every year for 7 years, these are kids between 7 and 17, 45 neurobehavioral tests were administered to see if there was a difference between the 2 groups. So here's what happened. In the original study, which was published in JAM, and it was a big deal because it said there wasn't any difference. Okay? Amalgams are safe. And by the way, the American Dental Association pushed to have Congress allocate this money because they believe in amalgam fillings. Now here's what happens when you add genetics. So one of the researchers involved in the study didn't like that data, so he actually went and genotyped all these kids and discovered that 1 out of 5 of them are at risk for neurodevelopmental delays. And these are really significant, this is pretty significant data. It's strong effects, all of that, and it tends to affect boys more than girls. So this is just the data depicted in another way. If you have a low genetic risk and you're 17 years old, you have a normal developmental score on all these tests that were taken. But if you have a medium or a high risk genetically and you're exposed to mercury, and that's important, you have a 3 to 6 year developmental delay. So this is ecogenetics. This is personalized health, if you will, because this is a predictive test that tells you something you can do. You can do it and avoid, hopefully, this problem. So I'm going to leave you with just some thoughts that we'll probably talk about on the panel about, in general, some of the things that we need to think about all of these tests that I took, and you will all probably be taking if you haven't taken some of them already. So we literally need a revolution in integration. And we're talking a lot about that here, and I'm happy to hear that. And interpretive tools, partly to help me figure out what the heck's going on with all that data. I usually talk a lot about this, but we don't have time. We might get into it in the panel. But it's not just exponential technologies, and it's not even just exponential integration. It's also exponential politics, exponential law, exponential business. I mean, all of these things need to keep up. And that's actually where I worry the most, especially given the crew we have in Washington, D.C. at the moment, keeping up. So there's still gaps between IT and biomedicine. And of course, there's all the ethical issues, which we don't have time to get into right now, but I just wanted to stick in your mind. Finally, I promised, how long do you want to live? Here are the results from about 40,000 people. 80 years is about 58%, 120 years, 29, 30%. So that's where you guys were. So you weren't voting with the rest of the majority of people. 150 years around 10%, and forever around 3%. And we have an online survey that you can take, www.whenI'm164, if you want to vote. And thank you.